It was early spring in Malibu, the kind of morning where the sea breeze carried both warmth and a hint of cold. Robert Downey Jr. stepped onto his balcony, a mug of coffee in hand, eyes still heavy from sleep. He almost didn't notice it at first. A small, crumpled figure in the corner near the potted lemon tree. It was a bird, tiny feathers ruffled, its wing twisted at an angle that looked painfully wrong. For a moment, Robert froze. He wasn't sure if it was alive. Slowly, he crouched down, setting his mug aside. The bird's eyes fluttered open. Frightened, but still holding on. He whispered, almost instinctively, "Hey, little guy, you're tougher than you look." The morning waves crashed in the distance, and for the first time in a while, Robert felt that familiar pull, the one that comes when you know you're about to take responsibility for something fragile. Robert stayed crouched there for several minutes, just watching the bird breathe. Each rise and fall of its tiny chest felt like a small victory. The little thing didn't move much, but its eyes followed him cautiously, as if deciding whether this towering human was a threat or a lifeline. He reached out his hand slowly, palm open. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if the bird could even hear or understand. It didn't flinch, but it didn't move closer either. That Robert had been here before, not with a bird, but with life's fragile moments. He knew that the wrong move could shatter trust before it even formed. He glanced around. No sign of where it had come from. No chirping from a nearby nest. No mother bird hovering anxiously above. This little creature was alone. "All right," Robert said under his breath, making the decision even before he'd fully thought it through. He fetched an old soft towel from inside and gently draped it over the bird. It didn't struggle, only trembled slightly. He lifted it carefully, as if it were made of glass. The weight was almost nothing, but the responsibility felt heavy in his hands. Inside, he cleared a space on the kitchen counter, away from noise and movement. He set the bird down on the towel and crouched to meet its gaze again. Dotted looked at him with a strange mix of fear and acceptance, like it understood this human was now its only hope. Robert's voice softened to a near whisper. "Looks like it's just you and me now, buddy." That morning, without planning it, Robert Downey Jr. had added another chapter to his life, one that would test his patience, his heart, and his ability to keep something alive that the world had already given up on. The first day was a blur of small, careful movements. Robert set a shallow dish of water near the bird, watching as it tilted its head but didn't drink. He mashed up a few berries and placed them on a small plate, hoping the scent would coax it to eat. Hours passed, and the bird barely touched anything. It sat quietly on the towel, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Robert found himself checking on it every few minutes, like a worried parent pacing outside a hospital room got in the afternoon. He pulled up his phone and searched how to care for an injured bird. Every article said the same thing: warmth, quiet, gentle handling. He turned off the television, dimmed the lights, and set a small desk lamp nearby for warmth. Later, he sat at the counter, elbows resting on the surface, simply talking to it. "You don't know me yet, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." His voice was low, almost a lullaby. The bird blinked slowly, and for a moment, it felt like it was listening. That night, Robert moved a chair into the kitchen and slept. There, head resting on folded arms. Every rustle from the towel made him open his eyes to check Dot by morning. The bird had eaten a little of the berries, just enough to let Robert know it hadn't given up. They were strangers less than a day ago. Now, it felt like they had quietly entered an unspoken agreement. He would fight for its life, and it would try to meet him halfway. The second morning brought a subtle change. The bird, still fragile, still favoring one wing, stood a little taller on the towel. Its eyes, once dull with shock, now held a faint spark. Robert noticed immediately. He was leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee, and when the bird tilted its head toward him, it almost felt like recognition. "You're looking at me now," he murmured, setting his mug down. He crouched low, moving slow, away. "You approach something that might vanish if you're too quick." When he placed a few new berries and some tiny seeds on the plate, the bird took a step forward. Just one step, but it was more than yesterday. Robert smiled, not the big kind that forces its way across your face, but the quiet kind you feel deep in your chest. The rest of the day became a quiet dance between them. Robert worked from his laptop at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing toward the towel. Every time he looked, the bird was watching him. He began to speak without thinking, narrating small things. "I'm just answering emails. Don't worry, I'll check your water in a minute. Yeah, I know, boring day so far." By mid-afternoon, the bird tested its good wing, just a stretch feathers ruffling softly in the warm lamplight, but to Robert, it was a milestone. He wanted to cheer, but he stayed quiet, sensing the moment needed stillness. Later, he tried something new. He placed his open hand on the counter, palm up, near the towel, but not too close. The bird froze, tiny claws gripping the fabric. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, with a hesitant hop, it moved closer, not onto his head, but close. Enough for Robert to feel the warmth of its tiny body. It wasn't flight. Not yet. But it was trust beginning to take shape. That night, as Robert sat in the dim kitchen with the soft hum of the fridge behind him, the bird shuffled its towel closer to where he sat. No noise, no flutter, just quiet proximity. He whispered, "You're not alone anymore." And in that stillness, it felt like they both understood the promise. The next morning, Robert woke up earlier than usual. The first thing he did before coffee, before even checking his phone, was head straight to the kitchen. The bird was awake too, head tilted, eyes bright in the slant of morning light coming through the blinds. Something about the way it looked. The him that day felt different, less like fear, more like curiosity. "Morning," Robert said softly. "You made it through another night." He refreshed the water, added a few more seeds, and stood there watching. The bird hopped closer than it ever had before, close enough that Robert could see the tiny detail of each feather, the faint shimmer in the dark brown of its eye. "You know," Robert began, leaning on the counter, "I can't keep calling you little one forever. You need a name." He thought for a moment, then laughed quietly to himself. "How about Hopper? You seem to hop more than you fly right now." The bird blinked at him, and in a moment it felt like fate's little nod. It hopped twice in quick succession. "Hopper it is," Robert said with a grin. "Guess you just approved it." For the rest of the day, he used the name in small, casual ways. "Here you go, Hopper," when he brought food. "Easy there, Hopper," when the bird shifted nervously at a sudden noise. By evening, it felt natural, as if the name had always been there. That night, Robert sat on the couch with a book, the kitchen light left on for Hopper. He could hear soft rustling now and then, the gentle, reassuring sign of life. And as he turned another page, Robert realized something. This wasn't just about saving a bird anymore. It was about filling a quiet corner of his own life he hadn't even noticed was empty. It had been a week since Hopper came into Robert's life. Each day followed a rhythm: food, water, quiet conversation, and gentle attempts to encourage movement. But this morning felt different. When Robert walked into the kitchen, he found Hopper standing taller, feathers puffed out, head turning with a kind of alertness he hadn't seen before. The sunlight spilled through the blinds in sharp golden lines, and Hopper seemed drawn to it, hopping closer to the edge of the counter, where his little temporary box was kept. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Robert murmured. He gently opened the box's side, giving Hopper a small wooden perch he'd set up the night before. "No pressure," he said softly. "Just see how it feels." For a few minutes, Hopper stayed still. His little claws gripped the perch, eyes scanning the room like a soldier preparing for unknown territory. Then, almost without warning, Hopper spread his wings, not fully, but enough to show that healing was happening. Robert's heart thud, dee-dee-dot. The first attempt was clumsy as short hop, an awkward glide to the counter's edge. But when Hopper landed, without falling, Robert actually laughed out loud. "That's it. That's the guy." Hopper tried again, this time managing a slightly longer flutter to the chair nearby. The sound of his wings, soft, rapid, determined, was the most beautiful thing Robert had heard all week. By the third attempt, Hopper's breathing quickened, but his eyes sparkled with something Robert knew well. The thrill of freedom. "Take it slow," Robert whispered, crouching near. "You've got all the time in the world." After a short rest, Hopper surprised him by taking a leap from the chair toward Robert's arm. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled a little, but Robert instinctively steadied him with a gentle hand. And there he stayed, tiny claws gripping Robert's skin, chest rising and falling. Robert looked at him in that moment and realized this wasn't just recovery. This was the first step toward the life Hopper was meant to have. And for reasons Robert didn't fully understand, it felt like the first step toward something new for him too. He smiled. "One day, buddy, we're gonna get you flying under the open sky." The next 2 days felt longer than any Robert could remember. Every morning, he'd make his coffee, sit in the same garden chair, and really listen for the faintest flutter of wings, the smallest sound of Hopper's chirp. But each time the hours passed, the only noises were the rustle of palm leaves and the distant hum of the city dot. By the third morning, Robert found himself pacing instead of sitting. The sky was a washed-out blue, the air warm with the promise of afternoon heat. He kept glancing toward the fence, half expecting to see a small blur of brown and white perched there. He told himself the truth. He'd known all along. Hopper was a wild creature. He'd done what he was meant to do. He'd survived, healed, and returned to the life nature had intended for him. That should have been enough. But the house felt different now. Emptier, quieter. Robert caught himself speaking aloud sometimes, forgetting there was no tiny head cocking to listen, no soft chirp answering him. That evening, just before sunset, Robert stood in the kitchen, washing a mug. The golden light poured through the window in that warm, almost nostalgic way. His eyes drifted toward the garden without thinking dot, and then he froze. There, on the edge of the chair where Robert always sat, was a small figure, feathers glowing in the late sun, head tilted in that familiar, curious way. "Hopper?" Robert whispered, barely daring to believe it. The bird hopped once, then twice, and let out a single clear chirp, the same sound he'd made the very first day Robert had given him water. Robert stepped outside slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment would dissolve like a dream. But Hopper didn't fly away. Instead, he leapt into the air, circled once, and landed directly on Robert's shoulder. For a few seconds, Robert just stood there, eyes closed, feeling the tiny claws grip his shirt. "You came back," he murmured, and his voice was softer than he'd meant it to be. "You're free, and you still came back." Over the next few minutes, Robert noticed something even stranger. Hopper wasn't alone. From the branches above, two of the birds Robert had seen on the telephone wire fluttered down. They perched on the fence, watching quietly. It dawned on Robert what had happened. Hopper had found his place in the wild, but he hadn't left his first home behind. He'd brought his new flock with him. From that day on, Hopper's visits became a rhythm. Some mornings he'd come alone, some with the other birds, always perching on Robert's shoulder before leaving again. It was never about keeping him. It was about knowing he chose to return Dot. And each time Robert heard that small, bright chirp from somewhere in the trees, it wasn't just a sound, it was a reminder. Sometimes, the ones you set free don't vanish into the world. Sometimes they find their way back, carrying a little bit of you with them. 2 more weeks passed, each one bringing small victories. Robert had begun moving Hopper's perch closer to the kitchen window every day, letting him watch the world outside, the swaying trees, the bright blue sky, the occasional bird swooping. Past Dot, Hopper seemed fascinated. His head would tilt this way and that, his eyes following every movement. But Robert could also sense the tension in him. The outside was beautiful, but it was unknown. And unknown things could be frightening. One late afternoon, Robert slid open the big glass doors that led to his backyard. The air was warm, with that honeyed light that made every leaf glow. Hopper, perched on Robert's arm, froze as the scent of the outdoors rushed in. "Smell that?" Robert asked quietly. "That's freedom, and it's all yours when you're ready." Robert stepped outside slowly, barefoot, feeling the cool grass under his feet. Hopper's claws tightened slightly on his arm, but he didn't panic. His head darted around, taking in every detail. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car, the faint shrill of another bird. "Let's try something," Robert murmured. He crouched down and placed Hopper on the low garden bench, staying close so he'd feel safe. At first, Hopper stayed completely still. Then he tested his wings, stretching them wider than Robert had ever seen. The sun caught the tips of his feathers, making them gleam like tiny brushstrokes of bronze and gold. The first leap was just to the ground, clumsy, but steady. The second was back to the bench. By the third try, Hopper was flapping harder, catching a bit of lift before landing. Robert sat cross-legged on the grass, just watching. There was no rush. Every flap was progress. But then it happened. Hopper gave a sudden, determined jump into the air and caught a breeze. For a heartbeat, Robert's chest tightened. This could be the moment. Hopper's wings beat fast, then steadied. He didn't soar high, but he managed a clean glide across the yard before landing gently on the fence. Robert's breath caught. "That's it. That's my guy." Hopper turned his head toward him, and in that tiny look, Robert swore. There was pride, like he knew exactly what he'd just done. He hopped down from the fence and fluttered back toward Robert, landing not on his arm this time, but on his shoulder. The warmth of that small body against his neck made something ache deep in Robert's chest. "You're almost ready for the real thing," Robert said softly. "But I have to warn you, letting you go is going to be the hardest thing I've done in a long time." The bird said nothing, of course, but Robert could feel the answer in the steady weight of him, in the quiet trust that had formed between them. And as the sun sank low and the garden turned to gold, Robert knew the day was coming when Hopper would leave. He just wasn't sure if his own heart was ready for it. It came on a morning that felt different from the start. The sky was a bright, endless blue, the kind that seemed to stretch beyond time. A soft, steady breeze flowed through Robert's backyard, swaying the trees like a gentle invitation. Robert stood at the kitchen counter, holding his coffee, watching Hopper on his perch by the open door. The little bird was restless, shifting, stretching, flapping short bursts as if testing something in the air. "You feel it too, don't you?" Robert murmured. By now, Hopper's flight had improved dramatically. Short glides had turned into confident laps around the yard. He could land on the fence without fumbling, could weave between the lemon trees without colliding. He wasn't perfect, but he was strong. Robert stepped outside, barefoot again, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Hopper followed on instinct, fluttering to Robert's arm, then to the top of the garden bench. "All right, buddy," Robert said, voice low. "You've been practicing for weeks. Today might be the day." Hopper tilted his head, eyes bright. The wind caught his feathers, ruffling them like a whispered encouragement. Robert backed away, giving him space. The garden was quiet, except for the hum of the breeze and the distant sound of waves. Venice Beach wasn't far. The first attempt was a high leap to the fence. Hopper landed effortlessly. He paused, looking out beyond the yard for the first. Time in a way that made Robert's chest tighten. Then came the second jump higher, stronger. He climbed above the fence, wings pushing hard, riding the wind a little farther than before. Robert's eyes followed every movement, his hands tense at his sides. And then, Hopper didn't turn back. Instead, he let the wind carry him over the alleyway, then over the neighbor's roof. Robert stepped forward instinctively, heart pounding. 4. A few seconds, the bird disappeared from view. Robert's mind raced. Too soon. I should have kept him longer. What if he's not ready? But then, just as the worry began to tighten into fear, a small shape appeared against the blue sky. Hopper circled once, twice, and then astonishingly came gliding back into the yard, landing squarely on Robert's shoulder. Robert froze. The little bird pressed his head lightly against Robert's cheek. A gesture so small, yet so full of meaning it nearly broke him. You came back, Robert whispered, his voice thick. You really came back. It wasn't escape. It was choice. Hopper was telling him he could fly now, but he wasn't ready to leave just yet. Robert stood there for a long time, the warm sun on his skin, the small heartbeat against his neck, and thought about how sometimes the bravest thing wasn't leaving. It was coming back. 2 weeks after that first long flight, Hopper's strength had grown beyond anything Robert expected. The little bird could soar high above the house, disappear into the palm trees down the street, and return without hesitation. His movements had become elegant, every flap controlled, every glide steady. Robert knew what it meant. Hopper was ready for the wild, but readiness didn't make the thought easier. Every time Hopper flew out of sight, Robert's heart carried a flicker of fear. Not fear for the bird's skill, fear of the moment when he wouldn't return. That morning, Robert was reading in the garden, the warm light falling over his chair. Hopper was perched nearby, preening his feathers. The peace of the moment was interrupted by a sound soft but distinct, the chirping of other birds. Robert looked up. On the telephone wire above the street, 3 small birds sat watching. They shifted and called out in short bursts. Hopper froze mid-preen, head turning sharply. His body went still, then leaned forward in that telltale way Robert had learned to recognize. It was the same posture Hopper had taken when he first looked beyond the yard. You hear them, don't you? Robert said softly. Hopper's wings twitched. He looked from the wire back to Robert. It felt almost like a conversation. Hopper, waiting for permission. Robert set his book down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. If you want to go, you can. His voice caught on the last word. For a long moment, Hopper didn't move. Then, with one powerful leap, he took off. Robert's eyes tracked him as he rose above the fence, higher and higher, until he reached the telephone wire. The 3 birds shuffled to make space. Hopper landed among them, uncertain for only a moment, before their calls blended into one chorus. The group stayed there for a while, then all at once they took flight. Robert's heart dropped as Hopper followed, vanishing into the morning sky. He sat back in his chair, the garden suddenly too quiet. This could be it, the end of their story. But somewhere deep down, he also knew. Maybe the end wasn't meant to be sad at all. The next 2 days felt longer than any Robert could remember. Every morning, he'd make his coffee, sit in the same garden chair, and really listen for the faintest flutter of wings, the smallest sound of Hopper's chirp. But each time the hours passed, the only noises were the rustle of palm leaves and the distant hum of the city. By the 3rd morning, Robert found himself pacing, instead of sitting. The sky was a washed-out blue, the air warm with the promise of afternoon heat. He kept glancing toward the fence, half expecting to see a small blur of brown and white perched there. He told himself the truth. He'd known all along. Hopper was a wild creature. He'd done what he was meant to do. He'd survived, healed, and returned to the life nature had intended for him. That should have been enough. But the house felt different now. Emptier, quieter. Robert caught himself speaking aloud sometimes, forgetting there was no tiny head cocking to listen, no soft chirp answering him. That evening, just before sunset, Robert stood in the kitchen, washing a mug. The golden light poured through the window in that warm, almost nostalgic way. His eyes drifted toward the garden without thinking Dot, and then he froze. There, on the edge of the chair where Robert always sat, was a small figure. Feathers glowing in the late sun, head tilted in that familiar, curious way. "Hopper?" Robert whispered, barely daring to believe it. The bird hopped once, then twice, and let out a single clear chirp, the same sound he'd made the very first day Robert had given him water. Robert stepped outside slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment would dissolve like a dream. But Hopper didn't fly away. Instead, he leapt into the air, circled once, and landed directly on Robert's shoulder. For a few seconds, Robert just stood there, eyes closed, feeling the tiny claws grip his shirt. "You came back," he murmured, and his voice was softer than he'd meant it to be. "You're free, and you still came back." Over the next few minutes, Robert noticed something even stranger. Hopper wasn't alone. From the branches above, two of the birds Robert had seen on the telephone wire fluttered down. They perched on the fence, watching quietly. It dawned on Robert what had happened. Hopper had found his place in the wild, but he hadn't left his first home behind. He'd brought his new flock with him. From that day on, Hopper's visits became a rhythm. Some mornings he'd come alone, some with the other birds, always perching on Robert's shoulder before leaving again. It was never about keeping him. It was about knowing he chose to return. And each time Robert heard that small, bright chirp from somewhere in the trees, it wasn't just a sound, it was a reminder. Sometimes the ones you set free don't vanish into the world. Sometimes they find their way back, carrying a little bit of you with them.